Welcome to another episode of Wealth Uncensored. So today I want to talk about how U.S. persons, so U.S. citizens, green card holders, and U.S. residents can benefit from UAE trusts and foundations. Now, I know there's a lot of stuff out there on TV and the internet and stuff like this that leads many Americans to falsely believe that they can transfer assets to a foreign trust or foundation and save a bunch on U.S. taxes.
Welcome to the Wealth Uncensored podcast, straight talk about everything that impacts your wealth. In each episode, I share what I've learned through my own experience and 2 decades of helping high net worth clients structure their affairs to minimize taxes and protect their assets for the next generation. I'll also feature special guests who are experts in their own field, sharing their knowledge and experience to help you protect what's yours. I'm your host, Jimmy Sexton. Let's dive into today's show.
I'm going to bust that myth right now. That's just not the case. Americans can't save on U.S. taxes by transferring assets to foreign trusts or foundations in the UAE or anywhere else. It's just a myth, and maybe it worked 20 years ago or 30 or 50 years ago, but it doesn't work today. The IRS has closed those loopholes, so forget about saving taxes by transferring your assets to a foreign trust or foundation, whether that be located in the UAE or anywhere else. That being said, there are still a lot of benefits to setting up a trust or foundation in the UAE for U.S. persons. And I'm going to go through what those benefits are in this video. The very first benefit is asset protection, right? So the UAE, especially DIFC, offers tremendous asset protection for people located anywhere in the world, including U.S. persons. So, one of the key aspects of asset protection is privacy, right? People can't take what they don't know that you have. The DIFC offers tremendous privacy in that, A, trusts are private documents. They don't need to be registered anywhere, right? So not even the DIFC knows that a trust exists that's formed under DIFC law. So there's no register or anything like that where the trust needs to be registered so that there's some sort of public record of it. And when it comes to foundations, because they're incorporated entities, they do show up in the public register, but only the name of the foundation, its address, where it was formed. None of the parties involved with the foundation, like the person that set it up or the counselors or the beneficiaries, are listed anywhere. And actually, for a fee, you can pay to even have that made private, right? So again, there's a lot of privacy, which is a key aspect of asset protection. The other big benefit is having your assets in a trust or foundation in a country outside of the country where you live and you have most of your assets. So in this case, the U.S., for most U.S. persons, has tremendous benefits, right? So let's say you're an American, you're living in America, you have all your assets in the U.S. If you get sued, a U.S. court is going to be able to basically take those assets or have jurisdiction over those assets, and you have nothing to say about it, right? But let's say, for example, you have your trust or foundation in the UAE, and a U.S. court orders that those assets need to be transferred to somebody else to satisfy a judgment or something like that. Well, the UAE is probably not going to recognize that judgment, right? They're going to have to, the litigant is going to have to go to the UAE and sue under their court system to be able to access the assets in the trust or foundation. That's if they even know the trust or foundation is there because of the privacy that you're getting under the rules there. You can even achieve additional asset protection by having the assets of the trust or foundation located in a third jurisdiction. So you're in the U.S., your trust or foundation is in the UAE, and the assets are in a Swiss bank maybe, right? So now you've sort of involved 3 different legal systems, which makes it very difficult for a litigant in the U.S. to access your assets. You can also have the management of those assets, which you'd want to do. In order to achieve this asset protection, you need to make sure that the control of those assets are not in the United States, right? Because if you have the people that are managing the structure are located in the United States, regardless of whether or not your trust or foundation is a UAE, a US court can just order that person to distribute the assets to you or to the creditor or whatever for fear of contempt of court and possible imprisonment, right? So you'd want to have the people managing the structure outside of the United States. So first of all, the big benefit to having a trust or foundation in the UAE and outside of the United States is asset protection, right? You get incredible privacy. You have the structure in a jurisdiction that is not within the U.S.'s jurisdiction. You have the management in another jurisdiction. You have a lot of privacy because there's no register with respect to trusts. And even when it comes to foundations, you can get a lot of privacy by paying a fee to not even have it listed. So the first benefit is asset protection for all of the reasons that I just mentioned. Now, the second big benefit of having a trust or foundation in the UAE and in any of the free zones that offer them, but I seem to like DIFC the best, is that you have very flexible estate planning rules, right? So some jurisdictions limit who can be beneficiaries of a trust or foundation to, let's say, family members, for example, right? Which doesn't leave you a lot of flexibility if you want to be able to leave assets to a charity or friends or something like that is not a family member. That's restricted in some jurisdictions. You can't include just anybody as a beneficiary of a trust or foundation in every jurisdiction. But in the UAE, you can. So that's another big benefit, right? You have this very flexible estate planning laws. Additionally, some countries and states, for example, have forced heirship rules, right? Like in some states in the United States, if I remember correctly, you have rules, for example, that regardless of what your will says, that a certain portion of your estate needs to go to your spouse, for example. Forced heirship rules are not recognized under the DIFC rules in the UAE. Therefore, regardless of whatever the laws state, wherever you're living or resident or whoever has jurisdiction over your estate, are not going to be recognized in the UAE, meaning however you determined in your trust or foundation who should benefit from your estate is who's going to benefit, because they don't recognize the forced heirship laws of other countries. Now, you also have a tremendous tax benefits in the UAE. Now, like I said, Americans can't save on U.S. taxes by transferring assets to a UAE trust or foundation, but you can save on taxes in other countries potentially. So, if you structure it properly, trusts and foundations in the UAE, their income is not going to be subject to UAE income tax, although the income would still be subject to U.S. income tax. But at least you don't have a second layer of tax to deal with outside of the United States. You also have centralized management, right? So having a trust or foundation is going to allow you to determine who's going to be in charge of your assets during your lifetime and after your death. So if you have a large beneficiary base, instead of you passing away, for example, and then your estate being distributed amongst several beneficiaries, and this is especially problematic. Like, let's say, for example, if you own a private company and this now gets distributed to 5 or 6 people, you could have infighting on how to vote the shares that they inherited, so on and so forth. And that can make the management of that business difficult and eventually lead to its failure. Whereas if you have those shares in a trust or foundation, it's going to be centrally managed by the board or the trustee, and they're going to be able to vote those shares in the best interest of the business rather than the beneficiaries voting in their own best interest, which might not be what's best for the business and might not be aligned with the other beneficiaries. One of the other big benefits of setting up a trust or foundation, this mostly applies to trusts, is that private trust companies are allowed. So when you set up a trust, you need to have a trustee. And so you have two choices. You have a professional trust company or a private trust company. A professional trust company is essentially a company who's in the business of acting as trustee of trusts. Now, a lot of wealthy families don't like this option because they don't want to hand their assets over to a third party that they don't know. for risk of mismanagement or being managed too slowly or something like that. So many wealthy families prefer a private trust company, which is essentially a company that is formed for the specific purpose of acting as the trustee of their trust. And then they can own that private trust company, or they can put that in another trust or foundation for estate planning purposes. But the point is that they get to choose the board of the private trust company, meaning that the trust is essentially going to be managed by people that they've appointed. This is allowed in the UAE and in the DIFC in the UAE. Now, one of the things that's really unique about the DIFC's or trust law is that a foundation can act as a PTC. So in most countries, a PTC has to be a company. And the problem with a PTC being a company is somebody has to own the company, right? So, usually the person that winds up owning the PTC is the person that sets up the trust. The problem with this is what happens when they die. How are those shares going to be passed on to the heirs, and to which heirs, right? Most likely these shares of the PTC are going to have to be probated. Forced heirship rules might apply. And so that's not an ideal situation. Plus, during the lifetime of the person who set up the trust, if they are the owner of the PTC, those shares are an asset and are potentially at risk, in the event of the loss of a lawsuit or something like that. So usually when you set up a PTC, the most advantageous way to do it, if the PTC is a company, is that you have to put another trust or a foundation above the PTC to own it, to deal with the estate planning issues with respect to the PTC. Now, in the DIFC, you don't have this issue because you can set up what's called a purpose foundation that doesn't have any beneficiaries, whose sole purpose is to act as trustee of that trust. And because foundations aren't owned by anybody, they're orphan entities, you essentially eliminate the need for one entity, right? Normally you'd have the trust or foundation on top of the PTC, and the PTC is then the trustee of the trust. But in the case of the DIFC, you can use a foundation directly to be the trustee, thereby eliminating one entity, which is, fantastic. I mean, this saves money, it saves administration, all of that. Like I had mentioned, if Americans do set up foreign trusts, there are several tax consequences in the US that they need to be aware of. Thank you very much for listening. We hope you enjoyed this and found it informational.
Thank you for joining me on Wealth Uncensored, where we help you minimize taxes and protect your wealth for the next generation. If you like our show, be sure to subscribe and leave a review. And if you have any questions or suggestions for future episodes, we'd love to hear from you. You can email us at info@esquiregroup.com. And don't forget to visit Esquire Group's website for more information on how we can help you secure your wealth. I'll be dropping knowledge again next week. Don't forget to join us.